Oh yeah, we'll take them today, but we'll start the oversight hearing. Do we need to do a quorum, establish a quorum for the oversight hearing? Oh yeah, okay. Good morning, members and audience. We will begin our meeting of the Housing and Community Development Committee. I apologize to everyone. We only have two bills up today, and the authors are not here. So we're going to flip our agenda. We're going to establish quorum, and we will begin with our oversight hearing and follow up with our bills presentation after the meeting. There are so many members up here. I don't want to waste your time, and I do appreciate you being here on time. Madam Secretary.
Torres.
Here.
Arambula, Bradford,
here.
Ng,
Here.
Gilmore,
Here.
Knight,
Here.
Saldana, Torlakson, Tran.
Okay, we have a quorum. Again, everyone, welcome to this Housing and Community Development Committee oversight hearing on affordable housing in California. I'd like to start by offering a warm welcome to all of our witnesses, as well as to everyone in the audience who made time to attend this hearing today. As we all know, maintaining and expanding California's supply of affordable housing is a constant challenge. Although the recession and the foreclosure crisis have forced housing prices down in the last 3 years, the median home prices is still well out of reach for the majority of Californians. In addition, our state has the second most expensive rental housing market in the country, as well as the second highest share of renter households. We also have a rate of overcrowding that is far higher than the national average, a clear sign that affordable housing opportunities are insufficient to meet the demand, and this is not taking into consideration the thousands of homeless families we have in the streets every day. Addressing California's persistent shortage of affordable housing is a challenge in the best of economic times. In the current economic climate, with federal, state, and local resources for affordable housing dwindling, the challenges are much greater. However, there are also a number of opportunities at the state level that we can take advantage of to overcome these challenges. And for today, we have three goals. One is to identify the challenges and opportunities to maintain the state's existing stock of affordable housing. Second, to identify the challenges and opportunities to increasing the stock of affordable housing, both in the current economic climate and in the future. And lastly, identify regulatory or legislative options to assist the preservation and creation of affordable housing. And I'll open it up for members of the committee if you have any comments or concerns you want to share with us. No? Okay. Seeing none, I'd like to introduce our first witness, Matt Schwartz. He is the president of the California Housing Partnership Corporation.
Good morning, Chairwoman Torres and Assembly members. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide you with some information this morning. I'm first going to begin by just briefly sketching out the existing affordable housing in the state that's at risk of losing its affordability over the next few years. And then I'm going to briefly talk about efforts underway at a federal level to try to preserve the housing. Our state's population of 38 million is roughly housed in over 13 million dwellings. About 5 million of those are rental housing dwellings, with the remainder home ownership. And of that amount, we have about 175,000 that are federally subsidized by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and another 20,000 through the United States Rural Development Association through the Department of Agriculture. One of the HUD's biggest programs is the Housing Choice Voucher Program. There are 300,000 vouchers in circulation in California. We have a huge stake in that program, so whenever federal changes are made, we try to pay attention to that. In addition, we have over 42,000 remaining public housing apartments in our state. Proportionally a small number for national, but still a large number that we must try to protect. We also have, through state programs and federal programs, created more than 200,000 low-income housing tax credit apartments that are providing affordable housing to our working families in communities across the state. And then there's roughly another 100,000 low-income protected units that are also subsidized through local governments, and I think you're going to hear later in this presentation from another speaker who's going to talk more about the important role that local governments play, so I'm not going to focus on that. In terms of the federally assisted stock, there are some new developments that I think are really important for this committee to know about. In fact, they're not actually new, but what's happened is the federal government subsidized these properties roughly 35 to 40 years ago. And at the time, the commitment in their subsidized mortgages was for 40 years of subsidy. No one really thought about what would happen when the 40th year came. Well, the 40th year is coming for many of the federally subsidized mortgages properties in our state. These are privately owned by a combination of for-profit and nonprofit entities. They're in almost every part of our state. You have in front of you a paper which summarizes the information, but I'm just going to quickly touch on it. We have, over the next 5 years, over 18,000 apartments that are at risk of losing their subsidies because of these expiring mortgages in California. Those are in over about 200 properties, again, privately owned and operated in almost all cases. And in the next 12 months, 1,700 of these are already at risk. This is critical because, believe it or not, the federal government has no program, no solution right now to how to protect these properties. Some of these properties do have other sources of subsidy that will cushion the impact on their residents. And the charts on the handout that you have shows those two categories. The ones with subsidies, the impact will be cushioned. The ones without, though, we really have no solution right now. We are talking with members of Congress about this, with members of with the senior staff at the Department of Housing. There are bills pending in Congress that would address this and provide resources to our state and to the owners of these properties. One of them is a bill by Chairman Barney Frank, the Housing Preservation Bill. But frankly speaking, the electoral politics of the midterm elections in Congress make it unlikely that any of that legislation will pass this year. We are hoping that at best we will be able to find room in one of the appropriations bills for a small program that would provide vouchers to tenants in these properties, so that if they lose their subsidies, as is projected with nothing else being done, at least the household is protected. The owners would then be forced to raise the rents. So this is again a problem that could have been foreseen. We've tracked it. We just thought that Congress would actually move to fix it, which they have not done yet. I'm not going to go over any more details of the data you have in front of you, but I'll be happy to answer questions. I did just want to briefly touch, though, on the role that the state has played in the past and I hope again in the future in intervening in these situations. The critical resource has been, the reason the state's been able to preserve roughly 20,000 apartments over the last 10 years has been the resources at the Department of Housing and Community Development, the GAP financing that enables private developers primarily to come in and purchase these properties with expiring subsidies and keep them affordable so they continue serving the low-income working people of our state who can't afford to own. And this is just one point I want to address. I know you all know this, but I keep hearing people saying, well, the affordable housing crisis in California is over because prices have dropped so much. Well, I think you all know that that's simply not true for our very low-income families. Even with prices dropping 40%, for example, in Contra Costa County, the low-income, very low-income people earning 50% or less of the median cannot afford to purchase a home. We still must have this rental stock that's available to them if we want to keep working families in our communities. So the state has been critical and continues to be critical. What's hard now, and I believe Director Jacobs is going to talk about this in a minute, is the state is running out. The very last of the last bond program funds are about to disappear this year at the very same time that we have these expiring mortgages. So the hands are really tied for many of the developers who would otherwise try to help out in this situation by acquiring these properties at fair market prices and preserving them, because the state has almost no money left. The federal government has not provided resources. So I know that these are very difficult budget times with very limited resources, but I just want to urge you, if there's a way, and I think Director Jacobs may talk about this, that the state can try to provide additional gap financing. It is critical, because otherwise there will be no way to help not only the low-income tenants, but the owners of these buildings themselves could be in financial jeopardy. They're going to be forced to raise rents. They're going to be forced to evict low-income families. That's going to be costly to them, and their future of their own economic properties is also at risk. So I just urge you again to do what you can within the Assembly and Legislature to try to help us address this. And I'm going to stop there unless you have questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for making the time to be here. Do you have any idea or any sense that these private owners are willing to recommit to these loans or to continuing the partnership?
Many of the private owners, one of my staff members who is here today, Nadia Shihab, spends much of her time talking to the private owners around the state of these buildings. So we do have a good feel of this. And HUD has been quite successful with their rental subsidy programs in offering incentives to the owners to stay in those subsidy programs by giving them market rents and keeping the market rents adjusted. So when offered the incentives, most of the owners have taken them. The problem is with the expiring mortgage subsidies, there is no incentive available. They hit the end date, and then right now that's it.
If somehow we were to make those, be able to extend that 40 years, is there a sense that they would be interested in renewing that?
I think many of them would be. And some of the ones that might want to get out of these HUD programs, and that there is frustration periodically with HUD, we all hear about it, they have an interest occasionally in receiving a fair market offer. And that's the other thing. We have developers, for-profit and nonprofit, who are willing to pay for these properties if they can get gap financing from the state of California to keep them affordable.
Great, thank you. Someone
Thank you.
I had a couple questions about just the program overall. I think you said in the beginning there was 300,000 vouchers in California. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Is there a cap at the federal level through the HUD program on how many vouchers can be released to each state, or how many can be released to the country as a whole?
The vouchers are made available through housing authorities in several states, including California, as a small state program. Several states have larger programs. Right now, those numbers are capped. There is legislation pending that would remove the cap, although then finding funding for additional vouchers is always a challenge.
What is the cap right now, or what is the maximum subsidy that you can get for a house in California? Is it around $1,800?
It's determined by every local housing authority. So it will range. In Sacramento, it'll be one amount. In Fresno, it'll be another amount. Roughly speaking, though, that the very low-income residents pay 30% of their income towards a market rate rent to the private owner, and the housing authority makes up the difference up to that market rent. So it's typically, the amount of the subsidy typically ranges from I don't know, about $600-700 up to about $2,000 in the higher cost areas per household per month.
Okay, and as I understand, you said, I understand we are in an election year. It's going to be very difficult to get much legislation through this year at the federal level. But it looks like 2011 it starts to ramp up. 2010 we're kind of in a not as critical phase here, but 2011 starts to go, and then 2012 and 13 are pretty big years. Is that the consensus? Is that where you're pushing to try and get legislation passed by next year so that you can kind of, curb some of this 2012 activity?
That's right. Although really to be able to head off the 2011-12, we really should have something in place this year, because it takes time for owners who want to consider whether to accept incentives to evaluate them. It takes even more time, as you know, for private developers who want to try to purchase and preserve those buildings at fair market value to try to make that deal. So we would lose time. It'll take at least 6 months to ramp up once there's a program in place.
What is the status of the federal efforts to convert the 4% tax credits into grants?
Thank you for asking. So just to give context for that, one of the most important tools for developers who want to buy and preserve these properties at fair market prices has been the 4% low-income housing tax credit. Unfortunately, with the collapse of the financial markets 2 years ago, the demand for the profits that people need to use these credits pretty much disappeared, half of them overnight. So the demand for purchasing these credits was half, from about $10 billion nationally to $5 billion. So we have been pressing, as Chairman Torres, as you just mentioned, for a program that would allow temporarily unusable 4% credits to be exchanged with the Treasury at a savings to the federal government for cash that could be used by private developers during this period. Unfortunately, although Senator Boxer and Senator Feinstein have signed on in support of this legislation, the Senate has not yet embraced it, and we're getting down to the last 10 days or so in which they might. The House, Congresswoman Sanchez did introduce a bill that got some support, but was not included in the small business tax bill that was just approved by the House yesterday. So we're at some risk right now. The House does not have a provision that would give us this tool. The Senate has not adopted one either, and we'll know more in the next 2 weeks.
Senator Lowenthal and I author a letter.
That's right. Thank you very much for your support of that. And in fact, it was critical in getting Congresswoman Sanchez's office to author that bill, H.R. 4687. And it did stimulate a lot of debate, and although it's not in legislation yet, we hope it still will get there.
Okay. Any other members? Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
For your time. Okay, our next witness is Ms. Lynn Jacobs, Director of the State Department of Housing and Community Development. Good morning.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee, honored guests. While our testimony is being passed out, which has loads of numbers in it, I'd like to point out that you all have received a copy of the new green building standards, which become mandatory on January 1st, 2011. This is hot off the presses. We just printed these last week. We are not printing these for mass distribution. We're putting the guidelines on our website. So this is a collector's item. They don't even let me have a copy yet. So they're for your use, and I think that's going to be a very helpful tool in the context of affordable housing, because we reduce energy costs to the homeowner or the renter. by about 30% by putting in these green building standards. So let me begin. As you may remember, I was here in January, and at that time, while we had dispersed a lot of the funding under Proposition 46 and Proposition 1C, we were under a freeze from making distributions because of the condition of the state treasury and the ability of the Treasurer's office to sell bonds. In April, we're glad to say that the Department of Finance rescinded those restrictions, and we were able to once again not only allocate Proposition 46 and 1C money, but we're the beneficiary of the Treasurer's spring bond sales. We received about $852 million in cash from the bond sale, as well as having the previous funds that were on hold released. So we have been working very hard to make up for lost time on Proposition 1C. We had, when the freeze was released, about $633 million left of the $2.875 billion. And we currently have most of it out in notices of funding availability, taking applications. We have funds both in our multifamily housing program, our set aside for housing for homeless youth, our home ownership programs, including CalHome and Begin, and self-help housing, our farm worker housing programs, and emergency shelter programs. So we are working on applications for the last of the funds in all of those programs this year. We have some new programs that also will be going out during this calendar year. Our Affordable Housing Innovation Loan Fund and Loan Practitioner Fund, our Local Housing Trust Fund money, our Construction Liability Insurance Reform Program, and our Catalyst Program, and our Housing Related Parks Program. Our Housing Related Parks Program, as you may remember, is rewarding cities for approving affordable housing by providing funds for capital expenditures related to parks and recreation. That is the only program that will not be fully dispersed this year because it's a 3-year program. They receive their funds based on building starts in the previous year. So because of the huge decline in housing production, we didn't want the money all based on this past year because we felt there wasn't going to be very much housing production. So that money will be dispersed over 3 years. I'd like to take a minute to talk about our Catalyst program, if I may. This is a new program from our Affordable Housing Innovation Fund, which is to provide funds for sustainable catalyst projects that are already implementing the requirements of AB 32 and SB 375. We have a diverse group of departments throughout the state that are not only contributing money to this, but also providing bonus points in various programs for these projects once they are selected. So we have teams looking at our applications right now that include members of all of the councils of government, as well as the departments throughout the state, including the Resources Agency, the Air Resources Board, Caltrans. There's a list. I haven't memorized the whole list, I'm sorry to say. Looking at these applications so that we can look at some projects on the ground and test measurements of vehicles, miles traveled, and other measurement forms to help in the implementation of those bills. So that's, I think, a very innovative and exciting program for us, and it's all new territory. You have in your written testimony the amounts that we've given out each year. I'd like to point out that with Proposition 1C, as you remember, the bond was passed in November of 2006. But in the fiscal year 2006-2007, we started awarding funds. We awarded $161 million in funds, And of course, the awards continued to increase exponentially when we had full years. I would like to make a correction in your written testimony. Yes? No, it's corrected? Oh, we're so good. I noticed a mistake at 8:30 this morning, and at 8:35 you have corrected testimony. I like it very much. Okay, so you have the correct numbers. Excellent. But as I said before, we have approximately $633 million left to award, and you see the schedule in there of the programs that we're going to be awarding for the rest of the year. Proposition 46, the ancient housing bond from 2002. We have a few funds left to disperse in those, but it's basically our workforce housing program, which is similar to the Parks program, rewarding cities for producing affordable housing by providing capital funds for any capital expenditure. That, again, was a multi-year distribution, so we're still in the last throes of distributing those funds. One thing that I'd like to mention about both of our housing bonds is the extremely large amount of leverage. With the two bonds, which total approximately $5 billion, we've leveraged over $12 billion of private capital in these projects. Normally, when we look at an affordable housing project, HCD's financing, no matter what program we're using, ranges from 20 to 25% of the total project cost. So there's always a combination of private resources and public resources in what we do. We've been doing public-private partnerships since we started financing affordable housing. We never do 100% of the financing on a project. And there's many good reasons for that. And all of our projects have a tremendous number of eyes on the project because they have local government, they have us, they have private financiers, local banks, and nonprofits, all looking at and working on these projects. That's one reason they take quite a long time to develop and finish, but we're very proud of everything that we've built at the state of California. You've heard some reference to, quote unquote, what do we do next? I will say, my husband would tell you how good I am at spending money, and our department has been excellent at getting money out quickly, accurately, and with the proper controls. But we talked to you before in January about finding a replacement source for the bonds once the bonds were spent. And we detailed the work that we had done going out to stakeholder groups and looking at possible alternatives. We continue to work with a number of stakeholder groups around the state in developing alternatives, and we look forward to working with the committee very closely on what their desires are. I'd just like to, not so much for the committee, because I believe you heard me say this before, but the cost of our bonds is like a home mortgage. When we put Proposition 1C on the ballot of $2.85 billion, we estimated the interest cost was $6 billion. It's going to be slightly more because the bond cost of the state of California has been a little higher than was estimated over the 30 years. So I kind of look at it as a 30-year home mortgage. When you get a cost estimate on your home mortgage and you see that line that has the interest, you're wondering, where did that come from? So we have been emphasizing looking at cost-effective approaches that don't have the tremendous interest cost of a 30-year program. So that's the end of my testimony. I'm very open to questions.
Assemblymember Gilmore.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm kind of curious as to what funding resources, if you will, are you looking Or are you looking at mechanisms, funding mechanisms, if you will?
Well, I'm very happy to answer that question, by the way. But what we did was convene large groups around the state of everybody from local PTAs to the real estate community to the business community to the local government community, unions, everybody. We had meetings from San Diego to Chico, and we got lots of suggestions. And we took those literally over 1,000 suggestion of sources, some more unusual than others, and narrowed them down to the top 100 sources. We looked at those 100 sources very carefully in terms of how much money they would raise, how much they would cost to administer, what we would need to do to get them approved, what the approval process would be. And we then narrowed it down to 19 sources that are attainable. Not easily attainable, but attainable. And we are looking at sources such as a document recording fee, a mortgage insurance fund. We looked at transfer taxes. And I'll be happy to get you, Assemblymember, the list of the 19. It's on our website, but it's easier if I get it for you. Although our website's very easy to operate, they tell me.
Great question. Assemblymember Ng?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Director Jacobs, as I have often said privately in public, thank you for your assistance to local governments in trying to qualify for the 1C proposition bond funding. And certainly my district is very, very appreciative of the time that you came down and spoke based on our request. I had a question on that point. I wanted to know, obviously, 1C was a big deal in terms of getting money for affordable housing. So I have two questions. And number one, what is your, now that you've got about, 4 years now into 1C? It's been almost 4 years.
Yes. Mm-hmm. The end of 2006, yes.
Right. You still have some money left. What is your assessment of the ability for local governments to act to qualify, submit documentation, and qualify for that? In other words, my question goes to the issue of here we have a large pot of money. Obviously, it won't last forever. And in the process, your agency receives many, many, many requests. I think there were, I'm not sure how many applications you received, 900, you received almost 1,000 applications, and you made awards to about half of those. And so my question goes to, are local governments equipped to provide the documentation, the personnel to provide the implementation, and the knowledge of local elected officials to provide the leadership and oversight? And that's my first question. And number two, when 1C was pitched to voters, there were some, I won't say markers, but promises or expectations about the impact in terms of the number of units. How did the campaign literature compare with the actual delivery in terms of number of units, and how would you rate that?
I think we've been right on the production of number of units, but I will take the easy question first. You know, we're very fortunate at HCD that we have been administering a lot of financial programs before the housing bonds, whether there have been, my staff tells me that actually all these affordable housing projects were funded from the general fund in the 80s, that we would just get a big check from the general fund every year, if you can imagine such a thing. And we've administered many, many federal programs over the years for local communities. So we have a very good relationship with local governments around the state, as well as with local developers. And we feel it's very important every time we release a notice of funding availability for us to go out physically around the state and hold educational meetings for both local government and developers to talk about the program, the application requirements, and we provide continual technical assistance for both local government as well as for the development community. It's very important. Now we are doing a lot of webinars due to the budget constraints. We're not doing as much traveling as we would like to do, but we at least do one meeting in Southern California physically. We would like to do more because of the large population down there on every new program that comes out or new notice of funding availability, because we're continually refining our programs as we go along. We get feedback from all of our applicants, and we make slight changes each round, so we want to go out and make sure everybody knows. I'm very committed to providing assistance to both local government and the development community. And anytime a local government asks me to come down and meet with them, I do it myself, because I'm not always certain we have travel money for my staff, so I'm willing to do it. And I think we've done a very good job of working with local government, but we appreciate any suggestions. We rely on you in the Assembly to kind of let us know, gee, I've heard in a particular city that they would like to apply for something and they don't know how to do it. If you let us know, I'll personally contact them and we'll work with them. We have 478 cities and 58 counties, and I can't say I know every mayor personally or every chair of every board of supervisors. So we appreciate your help in, if there are lapses. But it's a key component of the success of getting our funds out. The one thing that's different about Proposition 1C compared to our previous programs is we have a tremendous amount of money, $850 million, that's for infrastructure and transit-oriented development. And so those are a new kind of analysis for us. Our friends at Caltrans have worked with us to put those programs together so that we can look at the transportation side of housing. And funding infrastructure on large projects is a new field for us. Not new in 2010, but it was new in 2006. When we put Proposition 46 on the ballot, we predicted more housing units in Proposition 46 than we predicted in Proposition 1C when it went on the ballot, even though it was a larger dollar amount. And that's because we have so much of the funding going into infrastructure. So when you look at the numbers and you see in the report that there were more units with Proposition 46 than Proposition 1C, that's what the plan always was, because of the infrastructure and transit-oriented development.
Thank you. Can you give us an update on the NSP program?
Yes.
Does the department have any indication on how many units?
I don't have that information on units. We serve 51 sub-grantees around the state. The larger jurisdictions in the state receive their money directly from HUD, and they do not report to us at all. So any numbers that we have will be for a very small section of the state. We currently are working with the jurisdictions. The most important thing is to get all the money allocated. Any money that is not awarded by September 20th of this year has to be returned to the federal government. So as of today, we have 69% of the funds have been awarded by the local jurisdictions, and we are working with them to make sure that all of it is awarded by September 20th, and we are very confident that it will be. We have many alternative projects in the wings if there's money that local jurisdictions aren't able to fund. So that's what we're concentrating on, but we will have for you by October 1st, a report of the number of units.
Awarded, not used. Or
Awarded. No, it's all going to be, all of our money will have the dollar amounts for each jurisdiction and the number of units served for you.
The September deadline is for
Awarding all the money, but not awarding it to a jurisdiction, awarded to a house. In other words, we awarded it to all the jurisdictions last year. They've had the money, and we've been providing technical assistance. It's very difficult for those of you who may not remember, this program is to work with already foreclosed homes, purchase them, rehab them, and then get them in the hands of a first-time buyer. The difficulties that we read in the paper about foreclosures in general and working with banks and has been a challenge in getting this money out. So we have quite a number of staff devoted to working with the cities, bringing in the banks, the local realtors, as well as local contractors to all get together to make sure that these foreclosures get put on the market quicker than they have been. That seems to be where the slowdown has been. So we're spending a lot of time out in the field, convening meetings with everybody so that the banks know, gee, if they would just finish the foreclosure process, here's somebody, here's their mortgage, they're all ready to go into the house, and there's money for the rehabilitation.
And of the units available, it has been very difficult for local governments to compete with private investors.
That's somewhat true. I believe that's more prevalent in the press than it is in reality, because the private investors have had the same problems of working with a bank that the local governments have. It's just that I think any uptick in the real estate market makes the front page of the newspapers.
Ms. Jacobs, I'm just curious on, as it relates to 1C and Prop 46 funds, do you have a geographic breakdown, not necessarily assembly districts, of how the money was dispersed?
We didn't bring a geographic breakdown today because we brought one to the last hearing and we hadn't been allowed to give out any money since then. I'm sorry we didn't bring copies of the old one, but we'll get one over to your office. We do have a breakdown county by county, and it's actually a very nice, colorful map. So we'll get that over to your office.
Great. Any other questions?
In fact, would you like me to get it to you for the whole committee, another set? Yeah, we'll do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, next we have Leslie Krutko, the Housing Director for the City of San Jose. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here today to speak to you. I'm going to talk to you from a local government perspective, and I think it's good that you had the federal perspective and the state perspective and now local, because honestly we would not be able to build affordable housing or preserve affordable housing without all of those partners. With the state money that Director Jacobs just spoke to, those funds need to have a local match, and so local government match is equally as important to ensuring that housing is built. I do have written testimony that's being distributed, as well as some slides, and the testimony goes into a little more detail than I will in my remarks today, but I would like to speak to those slides as well after a few moments. I've been in this business now for 30 years. In fact, I was at HCD when, as Lynn Jacobs said, there were general funds available for housing. So I've been doing this for a long time, and I can tell you that this is probably the most difficult time that we've ever had in the affordable housing world. It's a perfect storm. We had the financial meltdown, so we have issues with our lenders and our investors in trying to bring equity and to bring debt to the market to be able to build housing. We also have, we foresee that the Proposition 1C funds are are going to be depleted, and we need to have those funds in order to continue our production. And then at the local level, the last year's decision to take $2 billion in redevelopment funds from local government has really impacted locals' ability to come up with that local match. And I'll speak more to that as we go through. My testimony includes a lot of discussion of the need for affordable housing. There is a tremendous need. Despite the foreclosure crisis, as was mentioned earlier, we see that people are lining up for affordable housing. Our projects, we had one that opened last week, and we had 10 applicants for every unit, and that's without any marketing. The demand is there. We have long lists of people waiting for subsidized housing. We have people who are overcrowding. What I foresee, because we've not been able to build much housing because of this market crisis, is that when the jobs do come back, and they will come back, we will not have the housing supply that's needed for our residents, and our prices are going to go up again, especially in the high-cost areas, the more urban areas of the state. So that's a real critical issue. I'd like to speak to the San Jose experience, and that's where the slides come in. I mentioned the $2 billion hit. The way San Jose has been able to be successful with its affordable housing program is because we receive a great deal of redevelopment funding. We have the second largest redevelopment agency in the state. We have created over 18,000 affordable units in the 20 years of the housing department's existence, and would continue to provide housing at that pace if the money were available. We need the access, as I mentioned earlier, to the state money as well as these redevelopment dollars in order to make that happen. San Jose took a $75 million hit. At $62 million this year, we paid a $62 million check to the state in May, and $40 million of that came from the housing fund. And the reason for that is that that San Jose's redevelopment agency is very, very active. The 80% fund, the non-housing portion, did not have the ability to pay the money. They are completely bonded and did not have any revenue available that was not already committed to projects. The housing fund didn't have money either, but we did have some bonding capacity that we intended to use for existing projects in the pipeline. We had to go to market. We went to market in April, and we issued debt to pay the state. So we paid the $40 million at a cost of $40 million plus about $4 million a year for as long as it takes to pay off the debt. So very costly for us to do that. The impact of that is shown in the slides, and I can show you what we expect. If you look at the first slide of the budget outlook, it shows that we go back 2 years, showing 2007, 8, and 8, 9, what our budget was for projects, what it is in 9, 10, which was pre-CRAF hit, and then we go substantially down to next to no production in the out years. The next slide shows the projects that are in the pipeline, and I would say it's about 1,200 units, but these units are those that already are ready to go. We have well over 1,000 additional units that are in the planning stages, where they've spent substantial amounts of money to get to this point where they're not going to move forward. These projects either already have local government money in them. There are several here where we have already purchased the land. and there are others that are, 3 of them are zoned but have not yet received a local government infusion of money. These projects are not moving forward and will not move forward in the next 5 years. So that's the impact of the redevelopment hit on San Jose. The next slide really shows something that's the other role and relationship that locals have with the state, which is that the state, through its housing element, requires local governments to plan for affordable housing production. And we've been very successful in the past. We were very happy in our last housing element round that San Jose got an A+. We met our need. We came very close to meeting our need for very low and low income units and extremely low income units. And that's really our goal, is to continue to do that. We will not do that going forward. We can tell you right now we won't. We have planned for it. But you can do all the planning you want. If you don't have the resources, it won't happen. So this is our estimate of where we will be at the end of our next housing element time frame. So we will obviously not be getting that A+ this next time around. Wanted to speak in the last slide to the lost economic benefits, because that's one of the things that's so important about affordable housing, and it's something that I have to mention a lot in my city role as we compare housing to building job-producing functions, commercial and industrial property. There's a lot of feeling that affordable housing or housing itself is not as important to the economy as job-producing properties. And what I try to say to that is you have to remember how important housing construction is to the economy. Not only does housing provide places for our workers to live, so those jobs that you're creating, people need to live there, but it creates money, it creates jobs for construction workers, it creates ongoing jobs, and it creates taxes and other revenues that local governments can use. So this chart, it has a lot of numbers here, but it just shows you that from the projects in San Jose that will not be going forward, the estimated first-year loss is about $90 million in local income to our economy, and about $9.5 million in taxes and fees to our local government, and 1,400 jobs. That's the first-year impact, and then there are ongoing impacts as well. This doesn't speak to the leverage. One of the things that's important about the redevelopment funding is for every $5 million in tax increment, we're able to borrow $50 million. And then we take that $50 million and leverage it with $3 for every one. So we leverage it on $150 million for a total of $200 million. We did that with $5 million. So it's very important. And I think as I end my comments today, the important things for me to say are the relationship between local government and state government is critical. It's the way that we're able to build housing. We do need the state to continue to fund affordable housing and really encourage the discussions, the positive discussions that have been going on the permanent source. And we very much want you to understand and recognize the impact of the redevelopment hit on local government's ability to meet the goals. And I think just lastly, the relationship between the state and local governments as we plan for affordable housing and the housing element needs is also a concern of ours. So with that, I will end by saying I'm eternally optimistic. I know that we're going to get through this, but I do think we have quite a number of challenges right now.
Thank you for your comments. Any questions? Assemblymember Tran? No? Mr. Bradford? Mr. Knight?
Has local government heard anything? You know, we get these RHNA requirements, and we have to kind of adhere to these a little bit. I always questioned that when I was on the city council, or else what are you going to do to us? But I understand what they can do to us. as we continue up here at the legislature to do things like take redevelopment dollars away from local government, and that's kind of the lifeblood of what local government can do for low and moderately low income housing. I know that firsthand. Do the RHNA requirements continue to stay the same? Do they continue to go up in this curve, and we continue to take money away from you to kind of hold you to your feet to the fire for that?
Yeah, I think two responses to that. Yes, our RHNA requirements for this upcoming period are higher than they were the last period. And some of that is for really good policy reasons. It's because we would like to see development in more urban areas and next to jobs and transportation. So some of the more urban areas have taken more RHNA need. Yeah, there is no connection right now between the RHNA policy goals and the distribution of state housing dollars. So that's one issue that we've always felt was important, is that if we're planning for affordable housing because the state has required it, that it would be helpful to have the money flow to the areas with the greatest need.
Can you talk about your local experience in San Jose with NSP funds and how you maximize their use?
Certainly. With NSP, we received $5.6 million in our first allocation through NSP 1. And those funds have been spent, and we are now working on NSP 2. That process was a competitive process as opposed to the first, which was an entitlement. So we received a much larger $25 million amount. We expect that's going to take a couple of years to spend, but we have already started spending those funds. So we've managed to spend the money. I think from our perspective, it's a little unfortunate that the money needed to be used to buy foreclosed property. I think in some areas that makes sense. In San Jose, we have lots of investors buying up foreclosed property, and what we'd really like to do is keep people in their units. But instead, we have to wait until they're displaced and then buy the units. But we have been able to, so we're buying them, and we're using the funds as best we can.
Great. Thank you very much. Unless there are any other comments or questions from the members, we will open it up for I apologize. We have one more speaker, Ms. Julie Snyder. I'm getting ahead of myself. Policy Director of Housing California. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. I'm here today to present the perspective of nonprofit below market rate developers. And I'm going to start with a bit of an outline of the current housing market situation, identify some of the current challenges that our developers are facing, and then highlight a couple opportunities that I see for you all in the coming year in addressing some of these problems. So as previous speakers mentioned, housing affordability in California continues to be a big challenge even with the current foreclosure crisis. The reason is that foreclosures are lowering sale prices, but they're not in any way actually increasing the supply of homes in the market. Every person who lived in a foreclosed home, whether they were a renter of that home or an owner, still needs to find somewhere to live. And that's actually causing a tightening of the rental market in some areas, making it even harder for lower income households to find a place to afford. And the fundamental problem in California is that the housing market isn't meeting the continuing growing demand as we have more residents, primarily through births, but also through immigration. On average, the need in California on an annual basis is 220,000 new homes, apartments, condos, single-family homes. In the last basically 30 years since 1990, neither the number of homes nor the type of homes that have been built have met that demand. And even in high productivity years, the vast majority of the homes that have been built have been large for-sale homes. They haven't been apartments, they haven't been condominiums, they haven't even been the small starter homes that new families need. And there's been a particularly stark difference between supply and demand in the apartment market. Production of apartments dropped dramatically in the state in the late 1990s and has never rebounded. In 1970, almost 67% of the homes that were built in the state were apartments. By the 90s, that had dropped to 30% and remains at that level. And as a result, the production of homes that are affordable to lower income households is roughly 1 million homes behind demand as of today, and every year that gap gets bigger and bigger. So that gap is the reason I think that we're here today and why we're interested in talking with you. It's to examine how the state has been and can continue to work with the private sector, both nonprofit developers and also for-profit developers, to increase the variety of homes that are built in California and the overall supply so we can close that gap. It's definitely a challenging task right now. As a number of the previous speakers mentioned, we have a convergence of the recession and other factors that are affecting a whole range of both public and private financing sources that we rely on to achieve affordability in our developments. So even prior to the recession, but certainly exacerbated by the recession, California's changing economy had created a persistent gap between development costs and the wages that families earn, and therefore what they're able to afford in their rents and their mortgages. And to fill that gap, below market rate developers pieced together a puzzle of anywhere from 5 to 10 public and private financing sources. Over the past 2 years, a number of these sources have either fled the market or are rapidly diminishing. So I wanted to talk about a couple of those and the status of them. First, the state's ongoing budget problems, especially the cash flow crunch that you all faced in late 2008, spooked private lenders and tax credit investors who are key partners in our multifamily developments. They largely stopped investing in tax credits, and they stopped making loans for fear that the state wouldn't come through on its funding commitments because of the cash flow problem. This situation is starting to improve, but we're nowhere near the levels that we were back in early 2008. So that's a significant challenge. Second, on the home ownership side, CalHFA suspended a number of its programs, and this eliminated a significant source of mortgage financing for first-time low and moderate income home buyers. And at the same time, in the private market, with the foreclosure crisis, it's much harder for potential homeowners, especially first-time buyers, to qualify for a loan. You need a much higher credit score and a much higher down payment than you did in the past. And from the developer perspective, those same lenders are much more reluctant to fund the acquisition and development of subdivisions for single family. So that's another piece of the puzzle. In the private market, for single family, financing's become much tighter. Third, as Director Jacobs mentioned, the main source of state funding, which is GO bonds, is almost gone. The National Trust Fund, keep our fingers crossed, may replace a portion of that financing for a year, but after that, production in the state is going to drop precipitously without a replacement funding source. And that will result in the state losing significant industry capacity that's been built up over the past decade through Prop 46 and 1C. Lastly, as Ms. Krutko outlined, the legislature's decision to transfer redevelopment funds to schools resulted in roughly, we're still getting final numbers, but roughly $630 million being borrowed from the low and moderate income housing fund. This is on top of the hit that redevelopment agencies were already taking because of declining property tax revenues. Redevelopment in California is the single largest source of public financing for multifamily developments that are affordable to lower income Californians, so this has been a big hit. We estimate the 2-year transfer equates to approximately 8,500 apartment homes that won't be built and 10,000 construction jobs lost. So you can see the significance of that. So in response to the diminution in both public and private financing options, below market developers have scaled back their future development plans. In some cases, they've closed their doors, and we know that this will have long-term impacts in all of your communities. The future, though, isn't completely bleak. As the director from San Jose said, I'm an optimist. I believe that there are options and opportunities for you in the coming year. As I mentioned, both private lenders and tax credit investors are beginning to come back into the marketplace, which is a good sign. However, their capital, what they're willing to bring to the table, has to be matched with state investment in order to put together that puzzle of multiple funding sources that I mentioned. So this is perhaps your biggest challenge in the coming year, finding a way to fill the massive hole that's going to be left when the Prop 1C funds run out. Faced with similar situations, 26 other states have shifted to the pay-as-you-go approach that Director Jacobs mentioned. They've created ongoing dedicated revenue sources from real estate transfer taxes by reducing the mortgage interest deduction that's available to the highest income households and other creative approaches. And we do hope to be back before you next year with a solid proposal that will spur California's market to build the homes that are needed year after year so that we can address the gap and then ensure that in future years we are not creating a new gap. Another opportunity may lie in improved expenditure of some of the redevelopment revenues. There are communities that lack either the expertise or the will to effectively use their housing funds. I will say San Jose is certainly not one of those. I think a lot of areas could learn from what they have done with their money. And solid numbers on redevelopment money are hard to come by, but we do know that millions of dollars in the housing funds go either unspent or are spent on perhaps one might say less efficient or questionable uses. So we hope to partner with redevelopment agencies in specific areas of the state to improve the spending of those funds. So I'll just close by noting that the benefits of addressing these financing challenges extend far beyond ensuring that your constituents can afford their rents and mortgages. If you're successful in the coming year with addressing them, your businesses will find it easier to attract and retain employees. Classrooms will be more stable as fewer children move in and out. And demands on law enforcement will lessen when you have fewer people living in substandard buildings or on the street. So the benefits are myriad, and we thank you very much for the opportunity to share our perspective with you today.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Any other questions from the members? Comments? No? Thank you again for being here. We'll go ahead and open up for public comment. And we have one author that is ready to testify on his bill, so I would ask that you limit your comments to about 3 minutes. If there's anybody from the audience that wants to come up, and seeing none.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is John Shire. I'm the Executive Director of the California Redevelopment Association. You've heard comments about redevelopment here this morning, and I just want to observe that you heard from Matt about declining federal subsidies and the future of that, and the prospects are not bright given the federal deficit problems that we're looking at. You've heard from Director Jacobs and Julie about the state situation. We're spending those bond monies and they're drawing down, and we don't have some source of money to follow on. And what are the prospects of passing yet another bond issue in California for housing? You know, that kind of leaves you with local money, which is redevelopment money, and that's money that you've chosen to take as part of the solution for solving the state's deficit problems. But that is money that could continue if you allow it to continue. And so if we're going to find solutions for some of these other drop-offs in housing money, you know, redevelopment is one place that you can look to for that. As was commented, when redevelopment agencies had to make those payments of $1.7 billion on May the 10th, we know that most agencies use their housing monies in order to be able to make those payments. Now, those are loans. Those are loans that they have to pay back to housing within 5 years. But I've already heard from some agencies that have said, looking at cash flow, they're not sure they can make those repayments of those housing monies within that 5 years. But our problem in the economy is right now. And when those dollars are taken from agencies, those are dollars that would otherwise go in investments that would produce jobs. The $2 billion represents potentially a couple of 100,000 jobs, mostly in construction or in construction-related industries, those various businesses and industries in California that produce materials and products and so forth that support housing. So there's a direct effect and an indirect effect when those dollars are taken away from agencies. Everybody knows the unemployment rate in California is high, but when we look at construction, it's more than 30%. So one of every 3 construction workers in the state basically is out of a job, and those are dollars, including those housing dollars, that could support those individuals. So I think we need to look at kind of the broader economic impact of these kinds of actions, as well as those direct impacts on the supply of affordable housing in California. You know, one of the reasons that businesses always give as to whether or not they're going to make a decision to be in California or to be somewhere else, yeah, you hear about the tax structure and you hear about the regulatory structure, but also on that list is affordability of housing for their workers and the availability of that housing within some reasonable distance of where those people would work. So that's another important factor for us to keep in mind as we think about how do we grow the economy in California, how do we create this big engine that we have that drives our state, that makes it possible for us to provide public services at both the state and local level. So I just want to add that perspective to what you've heard here this morning in terms of excellent testimony, and I commend you for having this oversight hearing on housing.
I want to thank you for your comments. I think, well, you should know that some of us on this committee have served in local government prior to coming here to the state. I myself spent 8 years as a local council member and mayor. So we truly understand what redevelopment agencies have had to go through, and we are in tune with that. I believe our current speaker, having served on the Planning Commission in the city of Los Angeles, very much understands the issue of redevelopment and how critical it is for our cities and counties. And having said that, I hope that we can count on your support with the new jobs budget, as it would pay back that borrowed money that was intended to be paid back over a 15-year period. We would make the cities and counties whole in the current year. So thank you very much for your comments, and we will now close public comment unless the members have any other concerns that they would like to address. I want to thank everyone who provided testimony at today's hearing. There seems to be a number of themes that emerge from the hearing today. California still has a tremendous need for more affordable housing opportunities, especially close to job centers. In addition to producing more affordable units, we need to be concerned about maintaining the affordability of these units that we currently have. The state is a critical partner in funding affordable housing, but the funds approved by the voters in the last 2 housing bonds to support state housing programs are nearly gone. I think that we all very much recognize that. We need to find a way to provide consistent support for state affordable housing programs rather than relying on the bonds and continuing to do the same thing that has not worked in the past. I hope that you found today's hearing informative and useful as we move forward to ensuring that affordable housing in California continues to be our primary goal. Thank you so much to staff. I know this month is June. June is Home Ownership Month, and so the hearing today was very timely. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the members.
If I may, Madam Chair, just commend you and your staff for putting this critical focus on the housing need, and as the witnesses have said, vital to our economy, the right thing to do for our citizens, a stabilizer for kids in school, a stabilizer for families, creates safe neighborhoods. So again, thank you for your leadership in bringing the focus on this, and there's a lot of work to do.
Thank you. And that concludes our hearing, and we will begin now with our two bills that we have heard. Our first author, Ms. Senator Hollingsworth, if you can come up and present item number 2, Senate Bill 9